This is Tyler, your antisocial critic and the host of the AntiSocial Network, your number one source for anachronistic conversations online. Come join us each week to hear opinions from some of the best voices discussing entertainment, politics, religion, and modern life on the internet today, most of which you've never heard of, but I have. This week we are joined by Professor John J. Miller. He is a professor at Hillsdale College, the host of the Great Books podcast at National Review Online, and the author of books including Reading Around, and The Polygamous King, a couple others. Good morning. How are you doing today?
I am excellent. How are you, Tyler?
I'm doing good. I just got my coffee, so I am feeling great right now. So I guess to start out on a quick softball. Your primary focus is literature. What are you reading right now?
I am reading Ravelstein by Saul Bellow. It's his account, his fictionalized account of the life of Alan Bloom, the real-life University of Chicago professor, the late University of Chicago professor, who is best known for having written The Closing of the American Mind. And this is to prepare for a Great Books show that I'll record in a few days.
Okay. Well, how do you generally pick the books for that then? What is your process?
Well, it's the Great Books podcast, so it has to be a great book, obviously. But
yeah.
Right? So, from Homer to Shakespeare to Jane Austen to Mark Twain, there are so many to choose from, and part of it's just what occurs to me is maybe a good topic right now. Part of it's driven by who I can get as a guest. Because it's an interview-driven show, we always need a great guest, someone who can discuss a work and so on. And so that's a matter of scheduling, finding the right person. Sometimes it's someone who's teaching the book right at that moment, so that the guest has the book on his or her mind and is just ready to go. So these are all the equations, and then of course trying to balance. I don't want to do 5 Greek playwrights in a row. I'm trying to bounce around between particularly American and British authors, but also by time and so forth. And I like to kind of hop around from genre and author and time to and chronology, all those sorts of things. But it creates a kind of randomness to it. Listeners never know what's coming next, which I kind of like. But over time, we get, I hope, a comprehensive look, a kind of survey of the best that's been thought and said by people across time.
How topical do you generally let the show get? I mean, it's the great book, so obviously, yeah, you're generally going back in time, sometimes thousands of years to find material. To what degree do you let the whims of modern discourse kind of determine what you're talking about?
Not a lot. The books are timeless, so you can listen to these shows at any moment. A show that I recorded 2 years ago might feel as fresh today as it did then. Occasionally, I'll try and make some connections with something that's in the news. For example, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, I was looking around for someone who could do The Plague by Camus, and I never found the right person, as it turned out. One of the people I approached about it said, I'd really much rather do Lord of the Flies, and so that's actually what we did. And someone suggested, because of the pandemic, to record on Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. And I was happy to reply, we did that a year ago. We're totally ready for this plague. So things like that happen, but really I don't have current events on my mind so much.
I mean, there were a couple things recently, I think, that probably could have used something like, obviously, like the 1619 Project probably deserves some, not necessarily direct addressing, but maybe just kind of like a little bit of subterfuge, just throwing like Common Sense or Federalist Papers in there, just to kind of like get a little energy churning in the opposite direction, Yeah,
that's possible. I do sometimes think a book can be a kind of touchstone for something that's in the news occasionally. But I don't want the show to be news driven.
Yeah.
I don't want names like Biden or Trump or Clinton to appear in the show. I think we've never spoken those names on the show since we started, which I kind of like. And so I definitely don't want to be heavy-handed with this sort of thing. I like to think that someone who thinks the 1619 Project, someone who thinks that it's awesome, would still enjoy the show. And we don't need to trigger anybody with conversations about what's happening right now in the politics of our own time. I do have my own thoughts on these sorts of things, and in my other program, my other podcast for National Review called The Bookmonger, which is a weekly author interview driven show about a new book. It's an interview with the author of a new book. We do get more political there. And so, for example, I recorded on the book 1620 by Peter Wood, which is a critique of the 1619 Project and offers a kind of alternative vision for how to think about American history. But on the Great Books podcast, I try to leave all of that behind and just have a good conversation about a book that we all can love.
Probably for the best. I mean, I can attest to the fact that the podcast doesn't feel dated at all. I've been going back and listening to the older episodes on epic poetry, because one of my current projects at the website I write for, Geeks Under Grace, is doing essays on and epic poetry. So being able to go back and just use those as kind of just a touchstone to kind of jump off of has been helpful. But yeah, I couldn't listening to just like the review of the Odyssey or Beowulf, I couldn't tell you that they weren't written or recorded like a week ago as opposed to 3 years ago.
Well, that's great to hear, because that's one of the goals, and my hope is that people like you can use the shows for purposes like that. I also hope that maybe students and teachers, homeschoolers especially, might be able to draw from it, and if they want to study epic poetry, they can listen to Beowulf. That was one of the very first shows we did. We did a show on the Odyssey. We did a show on Gilgamesh. We did a show on the Popol Vuh, which is the sort of the epic poem of the Mayan people in Mexico and Central America. And I've got one or two more that are kind of like that, on deck for 2021, and so we'll see. But thank you, and I'm glad you're able to benefit that way.
Sure. Have you noticed that there have been a lot of literature podcasts kind of popping up online in the last year or so? Is that maybe it's just me noticing that, but I noticed that like Spencerclavin over at the Daily Wire started his own one. A lot of the new websites that are popping up are doing book clubs. Do you think there's any reason in particular why that's happening?
I think there are a lot of podcasts popping up, and
yeah.
they're on everything, and so it's only natural people will have shows that are on books or culture. And Spencerclavin's is great. I've listened to his a couple of times, and he's been a guest on the show. He did he covered the book of Isaiah with us, which is something he has been translating from the original Hebrew into English, and that was a great show. And then we did one last summer with him on the Persians, the Greek play, and he's a classicist, so he really knows that one inside and out. He's a great guest. He's also a great podcast host. I definitely recommend that one for people who enjoy this genre.
Oh yeah, I've gotten a lot out of his podcasts. He's very good at framing the books in a way that makes them easy to understand.
He's a good talker. He has a good sense of humor. He explains things well. He's good at what he does. Sure.
So to backtrack a little bit, can we talk a little bit about how you kind of came into your current career path? I mean, you obviously do a lot of stuff. What kind of led you down to the path where you're working for National Review and Hillsdale College and all that jazz?
Well, I'll try and give you the quick and dirty version, which is that I've always been a reader. I've always been a writer, and I mean this going back to when I was a kid. And the idea of becoming a professional writer has been on my mind for as long as I've ever thought about what I might do professionally. And so in high school, I worked on my high school newspaper, and then in college at the University of Michigan, I worked at a student newspaper called the Michigan Review, which was a kind of conservative or libertarian journal of news and opinion and commentary and so forth. And it was sort of a minor league version of National Review. And I remember National Review, which I really discovered as a college student, as a freshman. I'd known about it previously, known about, who is Bill Buckley and that sort of thing. But it wasn't until I was a freshman at college I really started reading it. And, of course, noticed that this publication I liked on campus, the Michigan Review, clearly had drawn its name and inspiration in certain ways from National Review. I got to thinking, gosh, it'd be neat to work there one day. I'm thinking this as I'm 18, 19 years old. And at any rate, I went to college and graduated. I thought very hard about going to graduate school to become an English professor, which tells you where my interest in maybe the Great Books podcast now comes from. But I didn't do that. I went into journalism instead, and I'm glad I made that choice, actually. But went into journalism, worked in Washington, D.C., and after about 5 or 6 years in D.C., got hired by National Review, and I've been on the team ever since. That was in 1998, so I'm coming up actually in 23 years with the magazine. Most of my time there has been as a political reporter. I also do some cultural reporting and commentary. It's a mix of different things, but as a writer for National Review. And that's been, in the area of journalism, that's really where the bulk of my work has been professionally. About 10 years ago, I was invited to become the director of the Dow journalism program at Hillsdale College, and I jumped at that opportunity, partly because my wife and I are both from Michigan. It felt like a homecoming. Also because I really believe in the mission of Hillsdale College and what it's trying to do. And finally, because I've always enjoyed working with young people. At National Review, when I was going into the Washington Bureau every day, I enjoyed working with the interns. I kind of took over the intern program and in that office and just enjoyed meeting these college students who were thinking about careers in the media and really enjoyed that. In fact, my first one, to loop back to your first question, the first intern I worked with in that office was a young man called Matt Continetti, who was a student at Columbia, and he was terrific. Boy, he's one of the best I had. You could just see that this young man was going places. He's actually my guest on the Ravelstein podcast that we're going to record in a few days. Matt, of course, has gone on to a terrific career at the Weekly Standard. He was the founder of the Washington Free Beacon. He's now a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. This guy's flourishing, and it's been great to watch that. I mean, I like to think I was there, present at the creation to a certain extent. But at any rate, I've enjoyed working with young people. So the idea of Hillsdale College doing that was attractive. So I do that now. I'm talking to you right now from the campus of Hillsdale College in the radio station that we run here that the students participate in. And I still work with National Review, obviously. I write articles for it, and I do these 2 podcasts.
That's wonderful. I mean, there's a lot of dignity in being able to just kind of work with the kids and kind of bring up the next generation. I mean, it takes a lot of commitment. Not everyone can handle that, but that's wonderful that you find so much joy in being able to do that.
Well, teaching's a great profession, and we need great teachers. And I'm not saying I am one. I am saying, this is an investment in the next generation, and part of it is my feeling that I can leave a mark on a lot of people, and maybe encourage them in certain directions, and to think about certain kinds of professions and what they might do and what their possibilities are. And over the 10 years of working at Hillsdale College, it's been wonderful to see so many of them graduate and then go into journalism. And I now have colleagues at National Review who are former students of mine. And I have former students at other publications who have edited me at the Wall Street Journal, for instance, and that's just such a joy to have these to kind of begin as a mentor and then become a colleague. So many of them still call me Mr. Miller, which is funny. They can't break the habit. But it's wonderful to work with them here on campus and then later in life.
Yeah, that kind of leads into one of the other topics I wanted to talk with you about, being the kind of slow erosion of the classics out of literature. I mean, obviously Hillsdale College it's conservative, and it puts a big emphasis on classical values and classical education and making sure that young people kind of get the classics that they need to understand our culture and where we come from. And there's a lot of effort, especially even just in the last couple of weeks. Like, there's been a lot of people bragging about, like, oh, we got the Odyssey kicked out of our high school curriculum. Like, where do you think most of that desire to disrupt the classics is coming from, and what is the best way to kind of push back against it?
I don't know where it comes from. I find it incomprehensible, and I don't understand what motivates people who choose to do that sort of thing. Of course, we see it all around us. I know exactly what you're talking about with these gleeful tweets about people who have expunged Homer from a curriculum, and that's just it's revolting. I mean, of course, you've always got to, with any kind of curriculum, you've always got to pick and choose. What can you include and not include? And there can be frustrations about that. There can be disputes. I mean, you can't read every play by Shakespeare in high school. What one or two or three are you going to pick? Lots of choices all the time, but so much of it seems driven by not a discussion or an attempt to reason our way through what is the best course of study for students, but a feeling that we've just got to eliminate a kind of heritage that unites us all, and that's such a danger. What do we do to fight back? Well, one thing is don't go to the schools that do this sort of thing. There are many that have resisted this trend. I mean, it's happening all over the place, of course, but there are many schools that have resisted this trend. Hillsdale College, we have a very strong core curriculum, and you can't get through this college without, for instance, taking a course on the Constitution. Every student has to take a special course on the U.S. Constitution. I don't think any other college in America does that, with possibly the exception of the service academies. We also have a course on Western heritage, on the American heritage, that every student takes. And there are also language requirements and science requirements, and everybody has to do it. It's a pretty demanding core curriculum. You come here and you will have some choices in terms of picking a major and then having some electives and so forth. But really, a lot of students come here and they have a common experience. And what's great about that is you'll hear them at lunch, at a lunch table, debating what they just read, because some of them have read it, some did it last year, some did it 10 minutes ago, some are going to do it soon and they want to hear. And students here talk about normal student things as well. Who won the game last night, what frat is having what party this weekend, all that kind of stuff. But you get a kind of common experience where students can have these conversations, and the learning continues outside the classroom. What else can you do? You can listen. I'll say with humility, you can listen to the Great Books podcast. Or just read these books yourself. I mean, you don't need to have them assigned to you to read them and learn from them. It's nice to have a great teacher who can accompany these things. You'll have a richer experience of reading these books if you have someone who is a kind of guide to them. And my hope is the Great Books podcast is a kind of can accomplish that in 30 minutes once a week. You can listen to it before you read a book or after you read a book and learn. I mean, while you're doing it, you can learn something from it, and that will enrich and deepen your experience. And then you go listen to Spencerclavin's show on the same thing, right? I mean, these the way we think about these things, it never stops. And one of the values of these great books that we read, you can keep on reading them and learn more and more and more. And they're so good that you can just go to them again and again and again and keep learning about some of the biggest questions and thorniest problems that people ever have dealt with, and do it with beauty as well. I mean, the other attraction of these great books is their works of art, and they please us, they delight us. But along the way, we're also learning about what is true, what is good, and so on. So this is a great way to learn. And how do you resist this? As I say, go pick your schools and your teachers wisely. But then, you can do so much of this on your own.
Encouraging independent reading seems kind of the best way to kind of fight back against it. I mean, I just turned in. I'd never read Homer before this last year, and I just turned in 3,500 words to Geeks Under Grace about my experience reading the Iliad for the first time. And I ultimately come to that conclusion at the end: is you just got to read it for yourself. You got to kind of come to this material on your own terms and understand it, and more anything to want to read it, because you're not going to get anything if you're the lug in high school that just gets this stuff beaten into your brain and you can't handle it. But
I remember the first time I read the Iliad was as a freshman in college at the University of Michigan. I took a great books course, and it began with Homer's Iliad. And I had maybe gotten an excerpt or something in school, and I had read either all or a lot of the Odyssey in high school. But the Iliad was new to me. It was at least mostly new to me as a freshman, and I read it. It was homework, and kind of pushed my way through, and got a sense that there was a greatness here that I didn't fully grasp or understand it, but that there was greatness here in this poem. And I had a very good teacher, a very good lecturer in that course. He was speaking to 300 of us, but he helped us through. And I remember one point in particular that he made that touches upon your last remark, which there's this scene where I forget what book it's in, but there's this scene where Hector, the great Trojan warrior, approaches his young, I think, son, who is, I think, in the arms of his mother when he does this. And the child bursts out crying when he sees his dad, because his dad is still wearing his helmet, his military helmet, and so he's masked and he looks like a warrior, and the child is scared, and then Hector takes off the helmet, and that appeases the child who stops crying and sees the father that he knows. And our professor recounted this scene, and what he said is, you're going to read that one way right now when you're 18. He says, when you come back to this scene 20 years from now, when you're moms and dads, you're going to read this a different way. You're going to read it from a different kind of perspective. He says, right now you're thinking about the child. Later on, you're going to think about Hector. And he's right. And so one of the values of these books is that you can read the Iliad now. You'll learn a lot. You'll take away certain kinds of lessons. If you go back to it, particularly if you go back to it after years have passed, you'll see it in a different light. It'll mean a different thing to you. You may maybe your interpretation will be radically different. Maybe it'll be similar. Who knows? But you'll see different things because you'll have had an experience in your life that changes the way you think about what you read. And so that's one of the great things about these great books, is that you can go back to them over and over and over again, and they still have something there for you. It's like a well that never dries up.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps to learn to find things in it. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I didn't start getting into reading until of all things I took a modern world lit course where we read Camus and Kafka and basically the nihilistic and existentialist literature. And for some reason, when I was 18, that really spoke to me, and that kind of drew my first blood in terms of my love of literature. I'm actually going to have that teacher on in a couple of weeks just to kind of talk about how that class affected me. But sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second.
I find that certain kinds of literature also has a special potency depending when you read it. When we're at our most impressionistic, I think, when we're, say, in middle school and high school. There are books that I absolutely adore because I read them when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And a couple of times I've gone back to them and I've thought, I don't think this is that good. And it's, but my adult faculties have come in with a different kind of critical judgment. And there are a number that I think hold up really well. The Hobbit is still good. I mean, The Hobbit was probably the first, really big book that I read on my own. Not just sometimes we talk about chapter books when we're talking to our kids and so forth, but this is the one that actually felt like a real novel. And I read that on my own. I think that one holds up pretty well. And I was just in awe when I read it, and I was probably in the 5th or 6th grade. And at any rate, Watership Down is another one that I think does pretty well. But there are others that I won't mention that don't hold up quite as well. I was a big reader of genre fiction growing up, and I still am. I still really like it. I read a lot of science fiction in high school, and I don't read nearly as much anymore. I like the form, but I tend in other directions. I prefer crime novels now, for instance, more. And I didn't really read those much in high school. But genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy. I liked westerns a lot when I was growing up. I think they may have a special power for young people at a moment when you're encountering things for the first time. There's a freshness to them that may not exist later on. But if you read a book at a certain age, it can leave a mark that will be there for the rest of your life.
You brought up earlier that high schools kind of have to prioritize space when it comes to teaching people the books they kind of need to go into their adult life. I kind of assumed, just as a gut instinct, that that's part of the reason why there's such an effort to disrupt the text, as they say on Twitter, that they think that we need to kind of reorganize what we teach kids, that it focuses not just on the ephemeral dead white men, but also on stories of women and people of color. And I think that there's something good to that. I mean, I remember that the Modern World Lit class I mentioned, like, we did that, and we read the Japanese nationalists and Sherman Alexie, and a lot of stuff I'm still very fond of. But obviously the problem is, like you said, you can only teach a handful of books a year, so that ends up crowding out the classes. I mean, in light of things like the 1619 project that actually are going to start getting taught in schools, how would you recommend teachers to prioritize what they should be teaching to their kids, given that there's pressure to crowd out the classics for contemporary lesbian poetry or whatever, or what else? I don't forget that joke, the third wave feminist dance poetry.
Well, it depends on the course, and it depends on the age of the students, of course. So there, and then on top of that, there's an awful lot of subjectivity. But to take your example of the 1619 project, let's say you're dealing with high school students, and your topic is American history, which is what the 1619 project strikes at the heart of. It's an attempt to reinterpret American history through a particular kind of lens, and it's through a lens that has a sort of modern political purpose, which is always dangerous. It's about making points for today. It's a project that in certain ways tells us more about our own time than it does about the past. It tells us more about the political alliances and obligations of the people who are writing it behind it than it does about the people who have populated American history. But at any rate, if you're in that area of reading original texts in American history, I would start with the Declaration of Independence, which is the great statement of American principles. And we've been fighting, or I should say debating, or sometimes fighting, over what those mean and what that document means from the very start. But it contains those majestic words, all men are created equal. Well, what does that mean? And how do we make that a reality as we try to make our union more and more perfect. Never perfect, but more and more perfect. What does that mean? You start with, I think, reading that text, and then you can surround it with the U.S. Constitution, a document which the Declaration animates. I think you can't. Those are the two really key texts. And then as we walk through American history, if you want to go back to the era of 1619, I would suggest maybe the Mayflower Compact, which I believe is 1620. Which is about democratic organization in a new world. It's these people find themselves in a new place. They, how are we going to organize ourselves politically? And they write the Mayflower Compact. You mentioned Common Sense, which is a terrific document, one of the most popular pieces of political opinion ever written in America. And the life of Thomas Paine, my gosh, that's fascinating how he went from an American revolutionary, kind of French revolutionary, became a figure of controversy, and so on. But Common is a great document to read. The Federalist Papers, to interpret the meaning of the Constitution. Why do we have it? What do its parts mean? Why are they there? What are the problems it was trying to address? What are the opportunities it has? It presents, and so forth. You can also read some of the Anti-Federalist Papers, and off we go, right into the 19th century, into the great debates over human equality, and I would recommend reading some Frederick Douglass and what he thought about the Constitution, because he changed his mind about the Constitution. At first he thought it was a slaveholder document. Then he had a revelation. He said, you know what, the Constitution is the ally of black people, and because it's animated by the Declaration of Independence. And there's a very famous speech that he gives where he says this, and it caused him to break with some of his abolitionist allies like William Lloyd Garrison and so on. Anyway, Frederick Douglass, some of his speeches, his life story in his autobiography. He wrote 3 autobiographies of ever-growing length, and they're all in their own ways worthwhile. The first, in certain ways, is the best. It's also the shortest, and that's a good one to put in front of students. But we march through history then, going to the best that's been thought and said about the problems of our times as we go through history, and the disputes and the controversies and what people thought and said and how they argued with one another until we get up to our own era and we have an understanding of how we got here. So that's one quick, very, very quick overview of a syllabus you might put together to deal with some of the problems that the 1619 project tries to address. And I'll say this, there are a lot of problems with the 1619 project, and I would hope that schools would resist bringing that curriculum into their classrooms. Having said all that, behind it is a kind of cry for inclusion, a kind of cry to have the experiences of Black Americans particularly reflected in what we teach our children, and I support that idea. This idea, here you are, you and I are talking in Black History Month. Every February is Black History Month, and so there's going to be a lot of conversation about blacks throughout American history, and that's fine. But I've always not cared for this idea of Black history gets its month. Right? I mean, this is the time of year when we will talk about African American history. I can't think about American history without also thinking about African American history. Black people have been in this country from its very beginning, and they're a part of the story. And we need to tell their story, and we should tell it alongside, as a part of, of the whole story. I mean, you can't remove it and tell the American story truthfully. It's all together. And so the quest for Black freedom is one of the great themes in American history, and it must be told, and it should be told honestly and with a history that's populated with some heroes, with some villains, and with an awful lot of people who are kind of in between. And it should be told honestly and truthfully with I like to think primary documents and something that will give us an understanding of who we are now. Not segregated in the curriculum, as a part of what we do.
I think we're about to kind of bump up against the time restriction. Do you want to describe, kind of lay out where people can best find your work and where do you recommend people to listen to?
Sure. So most of my first of all, I have a website called heymiller.com, which is spelled Hey Miller, kind of like you're shouting at me, "Hey Miller." So you can go there, which has links to my work in various places. Most of my writing is for National Review. I sometimes write for the Wall Street Journal. My podcast, my two podcasts are both weekly shows with National Review. The Bookmonger, as I said, is a weekly 10-minute author interview with the author of a brand new book. And the Great Books podcast is a weekly 30-minute conversation with a scholar about a book he or she loves. And so you can find all those at National Review. The podcast you can subscribe to through iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play, whatever your preferred mode of podcast delivery and listening is. Those are the best ways to get to them.
All right, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate getting to talk to you.
Thanks, Tyler.
Have a good day.
You too.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions podcast. Editing, producing, and hosting are by Tyler Hummel, artwork by Topicality, and original music was composed by Melissa Lafira and the late Dan Smolla. Like, subscribe, and please let us know what you think about the show in the comments below if you'd like to see anyone interesting be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.